The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of Parliament House as Prime Minister James Whitmore adjusted his tie one final time. Today was crucial. The budget speech he was about to deliver would determine his political future and affect millions of families across the nation. Inside the Grand Chamber, members of Parliament filled their seats while journalists positioned their cameras for the historic moment. Outside the imposing building, Palace Guard Captain Sarah Mitchell walked her usual morning patrol. At 42, she had served the crown for nearly 2 decades, witnessing countless political ceremonies and state functions. Her polished boots clicked rhythmically against the stone pathway as she maintained her watchful eye over the grounds. The day seemed ordinary until she noticed something unusual near the fountain in the courtyard. A small figure sat alone on the cold stone bench, shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Captain Mitchell approached cautiously and discovered a young girl, no more than 8 years old, with tangled brown hair and tear-stained cheeks. Her worn clothes suggested she came from a struggling family, and her bare feet showed she had walked a considerable distance. "Hello there," Captain Mitchell said gently, kneeling down to the child's eye level. "What's your name, sweetheart?" The girl looked up with bright blue eyes filled with desperation. "Emma," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Emma Thompson. I need to talk to the important man who makes the rules. My mummy said he lives in the big house with all the flags." Captain Mitchell's heart ached as she listened to the child's innocent request. "Why do you need to speak with him, Emma?" "Because Mummy is very sick and the doctors won't help her anymore. They said we don't have enough money for the special medicine. Mummy told me that the important man in the big house decides who gets help and who doesn't. She's getting weaker every day and I'm scared she might go to heaven like Daddy did." The guard captain felt a lump forming in her throat. She had strict orders never to allow unauthorized individuals into Parliament, especially during important sessions. Security protocols were non-negotiable and her career could end if she made the wrong decision. Yet looking into Emma's desperate eyes, she saw something that transcended rules and regulations. Inside the chamber, Prime Minister Whitmore began his opening remarks about fiscal responsibility and budget constraints. He spoke about difficult decisions and necessary cuts to public spending. The words felt hollow to him, rehearsed speeches that his advisors had crafted to appeal to voters while protecting corporate interests. He had been in politics so long that he sometimes forgot the real faces behind the statistics he quoted. Meanwhile, Captain Mitchell weighed her options carefully. She thought about her own daughter, safe at home with her husband, receiving the best health care their insurance could provide. She imagined how desperate she would feel if her child were in Emma's position, seeking help from the very people whose decisions determined her family's fate. "Emma," the captain said softly, "what you're asking is very difficult. There are many rules about who can enter the big house. But tell me more about your mummy. What kind of sickness does she have?" Through broken sentences and innocent explanations, Emma described her mother's battle with a rare form of cancer. The experimental treatment that could save her life cost more than their family could earn in 5 years. Emma's father had died in a workplace accident 2 years earlier, leaving them with mounting medical bills and no financial safety net. Her mother worked 2 jobs while undergoing chemotherapy, but it wasn't enough to cover the specialized medication she desperately needed. The more Emma spoke, the more Captain Mitchell realized this wasn't just another sad story. This was a living example of the very policies being debated inside the Parliament building. Here was a real child, with a real mother, facing a real crisis that government decisions directly influenced. "My teacher said that in our country, everyone is supposed to get help when they're sick," Emma continued, wiping her nose with her sleeve. "But the man at the hospital said that's not true anymore. He said the government decided that some medicines cost too much money so they won't pay for them. I don't understand why money is more important than making Mummy better." Captain Mitchell looked toward the Parliament building, then back at the innocent child before her. She thought about her oath to protect and serve, wondering if that oath extended beyond simply guarding buildings and politicians. Perhaps true service meant ensuring that the voices of those who needed help the most could somehow be heard by those with the power to provide it. Time was running short. The Prime Minister's speech was already underway, and security would become even tighter as the session progressed. If she was going to act, it had to be now. The decision she made in the next few moments would either end her career in disgrace or possibly save a life. Looking into Emma's hopeful eyes, Captain Mitchell realized that some choices transcend personal consequences. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on her shoulders as she considered the unprecedented step she was contemplating. Never in her career had she even imagined breaking protocol in such a dramatic way. Yet here was a child whose mother's life hung in the balance, and whose innocent faith in the system might be the key to reaching a prime minister who had perhaps forgotten what real human suffering looked like. Captain Mitchell stood up slowly, her mind racing through the potential consequences of what she was considering. Her radio crackled with routine security updates from her fellow guards, reminding her of the strict protocols that governed every aspect of parliamentary security. She had never bent the rules, let alone broken them completely. "Emma," she said carefully, "if I tried to help you speak to the important man, you would have to be very brave and very quiet. Do you think you could do that?" The little girl nodded, eagerly, hope sparking in her tired eyes. "I can be quiet as a mouse. Mummy taught me how to be invisible when the bill collectors come to our door. I'm really good at it." The captain's heart broke a little more at this revelation of the harsh realities this child had already learned to navigate. She knelt down again and gently took Emma's small hands in her gloved ones. "Listen to me very carefully," she said. "The building where the important man is working has many rules. There are cameras everywhere and lots of people whose job it is to keep everyone safe. If we go inside, you must stay right beside me and do exactly what I say. Can you promise me that?" Emma nodded solemnly. "I promise. Cross my heart and hope to fly." Despite the gravity of the situation, Captain Mitchell couldn't help but smile at the child's innocent variation of the familiar phrase. She checked her watch and realized that Prime Minister Whitmore would be deep into his budget speech by now. The timing was both terrible and perfect. Terrible because security would be at its highest, but perfect because the Prime Minister would be in a predictable location. Taking a deep breath, Captain Mitchell made her decision. She gently helped Emma to her feet and brushed some dirt from the child's worn dress. "We're going to walk very normally, like we belong there. If anyone asks, you're my niece, and there's a family emergency. Do you understand?" Emma nodded, slipping her small hand trustingly into the captain's much larger one. Together they walked toward the imposing entrance of Parliament House. Captain Mitchell's heart pounded so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it, but her expression remained professionally calm. The first checkpoint was manned by guard Stevens, a young officer who had recently joined the force. He looked up from his security monitor as they approached, his expression puzzled by the sight of a child in the restricted area. "Captain Mitchell?" he questioned, standing at attention. "I wasn't aware of any scheduled visits involving minors today." "Emergency family situation, Stevens," she replied with an authority that surprised even herself. "I'm escorting her to the Family Services office for immediate processing. Time-sensitive matter." Stevens hesitated, clearly uncertain about the protocol for such an unusual situation. Captain Mitchell's sterling reputation and years of service worked in her favor. He stepped aside, though his worried expression suggested he would likely report the incident later. As they walked through the marble corridors, Emma's eyes widened with wonder at the grandeur surrounding them. Portraits of former leaders lined the walls, and crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows on the polished floors. Despite her amazement, she remembered her promise and stayed close to Captain Mitchell. Her small footsteps barely audible on the marble. They could hear the Prime Minister's voice echoing from the main chamber, his words carrying through the thick doors as he discussed budget allocations and fiscal responsibility. Captain Mitchell knew that within those sterile numbers and percentages were real stories like Emma's. Real families struggling to survive the consequences of political decisions made in comfortable offices by people who had never known true desperation. "That's him," Emma whispered, recognizing the importance of the moment. "That's the man who can help Mummy." Captain Mitchell paused outside the chamber doors, where two additional guards stood at attention. These men knew her well, having worked alongside her for years. Their surprised expressions mirrored Stephen's confusion, but their respect for her judgment was evident. "Captain?" Guard Harrison inquired quietly. "What's the situation?" "Critical family matter requiring immediate attention from the Prime Minister," she replied, hoping her voice conveyed more confidence than she felt. "This child has information relevant to today's budget discussions." It wasn't entirely untrue. Emma's situation was exactly the kind of real-world impact that budget decisions created, though presenting it this way was a considerable stretch of interpretation. Guard Harrison looked down at Emma, whose serious expression and tear-stained face spoke volumes about her desperate circumstances. Inside the chamber, the Prime Minister continued his speech about making tough choices for the greater good. He spoke about cutting healthcare subsidies for expensive treatments that benefited only a small number of patients, arguing that the money could be better spent on programs that helped larger populations. The irony of his words, spoken just meters away from a child whose mother needed exactly that kind of expensive treatment, was not lost on Captain Mitchell. "The doors will open briefly during the question period," Guard Harrison whispered. "If this is truly urgent, that would be your only opportunity." Captain Mitchell nodded gratefully. She had worked with Harrison long enough to know he trusted her judgment, even when he didn't fully understand the situation. She looked down at Emma, who was listening intently to every word, trying to understand the adult conversation that would determine her fate. "Emma," the captain whispered, "in just a few minutes those big doors will open and we'll be able to see the important man. When that happens, you'll have just one chance to speak to him. You'll need to be very brave, and tell him about your mummy in a clear, strong voice. Do you think you can do that?" Emma straightened her small shoulders and looked up with determination that seemed far too mature for her 8 years. "I can do it. For Mummy, I can do anything." The sound of applause from within the chamber indicated that the Prime Minister was concluding his prepared remarks. Soon the question and answer period would begin, and the doors would open to allow parliamentary assistants to move in and out. Captain Mitchell felt her palms sweating beneath her gloves as the moment of truth approached. The heavy chamber doors began to creak open as parliamentary assistants prepared for the question period. Captain Mitchell felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she realized there was no turning back now. Emma stood beside her, clutching a crumpled piece of paper that she had pulled from her pocket, a hospital bill with her mother's name on it. Through the opening doors, they could see Prime Minister Whitmore standing confidently at the podium, his polished appearance and practiced gestures reflecting years of political experience. Behind him sat rows of Parliament members, some listening intently while others checked their phones or shuffled through documents. The chamber buzzed with the quiet conversations of people who dealt with national issues as routine business. "Remember," Captain Mitchell whispered to Emma, "speak clearly and from your heart. Tell him exactly why you came here today." Emma nodded, her small face set with determination that both impressed and worried the captain. This child had already faced more hardship than many adults, and now she was about to address the most powerful political figure in the country. The weight of the moment pressed down on both of them as they stepped through the doorway. Several Parliament members noticed their entrance immediately. Whispers began to circulate as people pointed at the unusual sight of a palace guard escorting a young child into the sacred chamber. Security personnel stationed around the room tensed, uncertain whether to intervene or trust Captain Mitchell's judgment. Prime Minister Whitmore was responding to a question about healthcare funding when the disruption caught his attention. He paused mid-sentence, looking up from his notes with a mixture of confusion and irritation. The presence of a child in formal parliamentary proceedings was unprecedented, and his carefully rehearsed rhythm had been broken. "I'm sorry," he said, adjusting his microphone, "but there seems to be some kind of security issue. Captain Mitchell, would you please explain what's happening here?" Every eye in the chamber turned toward them. Television cameras swiveled to capture this unexpected moment, while journalists frantically scribbled notes about the developing situation. Captain Mitchell felt the weight of hundreds of stares, knowing that her career was likely ending in this very moment. "Prime Minister," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed chamber, "this young lady has traveled a great distance to speak with you about a matter of life and death. I believe her message is directly relevant. To the healthcare policies you've been discussing? A murmur rippled through the assembled politicians. Some looked annoyed at the breach of protocol, while others seemed curious about what could possibly be so important that a respected guard would risk everything to bring it forward. Prime Minister Whitmore's political instincts kicked in. He could see the cameras recording every moment, and he knew that how he handled this situation would be scrutinized by millions of voters. His advisors in the gallery were making urgent hand signals, trying to guide his response, but he found himself genuinely curious about what this child had to say. "Very well," he said, his tone softening slightly. "Young lady, what is your name?" Emma stepped forward, her small voice barely carrying in the vast chamber. "Emma Thompson, sir. I came to ask you to please help my mummy." The Prime Minister leaned forward, genuinely straining to hear her words. "I'm sorry, dear, but you'll need to speak louder. Can you tell everyone here why you've come to see me?" Emma took a deep breath, looked up at Captain Mitchell for encouragement, and then found her voice. "My mummy is very sick with cancer," she said, her words now carrying clearly through the chamber. "The doctors say there's medicine that can make her better, but it costs too much money. They said you're the one who decides if people like us get help or not." The chamber fell completely silent. Even the rustle of papers stopped as everyone absorbed the innocent directness of her words. Prime Minister Whitmore felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years of political maneuvering. The simple, undeniable truth of human suffering. "What kind of medicine does your mother need?" he asked, his prepared political responses seeming inadequate for this moment. Emma pulled out the crumpled hospital paper and held it up. "It's called, I can't say the big words right, but it costs more money than Mummy makes in a whole year even working 2 jobs. The hospital man said the government won't pay for it because it's too expensive for just a few people." The irony hit Prime Minister Whitmore like a physical blow. Just moments earlier, he had been defending the exact policy this child was challenging. He had spoken about difficult choices and fiscal responsibility, using phrases like cost-effectiveness and resource allocation. Now, faced with the human reality behind those sterile terms, his carefully constructed arguments felt hollow. Opposition members in the chamber recognized the powerful moment unfolding before them. Here was a living example of the human cost of the budget cuts they had been opposing. Some began to lean forward in their seats, sensing a turning point in the debate. "Emma," the Prime Minister said, stepping away from his podium and moving closer to her. "How long has your mother been sick?" "Since Daddy died 2 years ago," Emma replied, her voice small but steady. "She says the stress made her body weak. She tries to hide when she feels bad, but I can see her crying sometimes when she thinks I'm asleep. She tells me everything will be okay, but I know she's scared too." The chamber remained absolutely still. Television viewers across the country were witnessing something unprecedented, a moment of genuine human connection in the normally theatrical world of politics. The Prime Minister found himself face to face with the real consequences of policies he had advocated without truly understanding their impact on individual lives. Captain Mitchell watched the interaction with a mixture of pride and terror. Emma was handling herself with remarkable poise for a child her age, but the captain knew that both their futures hung in the balance of the next few minutes. The silence in the chamber was deafening, broken only by the quiet hum of television, cameras capturing every word and gesture. Prime Minister Whitmore knelt down to Emma's eye level, his expensive suit wrinkling on the marble floor. This simple gesture, captured by dozens of cameras, would later be remembered as one of the defining moments of his political career. In that moment, he was no longer the Prime Minister addressing Parliament. He was simply a man listening to a child's plea for help. Kneeling on the marble floor of the parliamentary chamber, Prime Minister Whitmore looked into Emma's clear blue eyes and saw something he had forgotten existed in his world of political calculations: pure, desperate hope. The child's trust was both heartbreaking and terrifying. She truly believed that he had the power to save her mother, and perhaps more importantly, she believed that he would choose to use that power. "Emma," he said gently, "can you tell me more about your mummy? What was she like before she got sick?" Emma's face brightened as she talked about happier times. She used to laugh a lot and sing songs while she cooked dinner. She taught me to read before I went to school, and she would make up funny voices for all the characters in my books. She worked at the flower shop downtown, and sometimes she would bring home pretty flowers that were too old to sell. Our whole house would smell like roses and sunshine. The Prime Minister felt his throat tighten as he listened. This wasn't the abstract concept of a patient or a statistic. This was a real woman with a real life, someone who had brought joy and beauty into the world, now reduced to fighting for her survival while her young daughter carried the weight of trying to save her. "What is she like now?" he asked, though he suspected the answer would be painful to hear. Emma's expression grew sad. "She's always tired now. Sometimes she can't keep food down, and her hair started falling out after the treatments began. But she still tries to help me with my homework, even when her hands shake too much to write. She tells me stories about Daddy and how proud he would be of how brave I'm being." Members of Parliament throughout the chamber were visibly moved. Some wiped away tears, while others stared down at their hands, perhaps thinking of their own families and how they would feel in similar circumstances. The political theater that usually dominated these sessions had been replaced by raw human emotion. "Emma," the Prime Minister continued, "what would happen if your mother could get this medicine?" "The doctor said it might make her better," Emma replied with renewed hope. "Not all better right away, but better enough that maybe her hair would grow back and she could go back to working at the flower shop. Maybe she could sing again while she makes dinner. The doctor said some people who take this medicine get to live for many more years with their children." The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone present. Prime Minister Whitmore realized that his next words would be recorded in history, broadcast across the nation, and most importantly, would determine whether this brave little girl's mother lived or died. The budget he had been defending suddenly seemed less like fiscal responsibility and more like a death sentence for people like Emma's mother. He stood up slowly, his mind racing through the implications of what he was considering. His advisors in the gallery were making frantic gestures, trying to remind him of budget constraints and political consequences. But for the first time in years, he found himself caring more about doing what was right than what was politically safe. "Members of Parliament," he said, his voice carrying a new weight of emotion. "We have been debating numbers and percentages and policy frameworks, but here before us stands the human reality behind our decisions. This young lady has shown extraordinary courage in coming here today, and I believe we owe her, and her mother, our careful attention." The chamber buzzed with whispered conversations as politicians began to grasp the potential significance of this moment. Opposition leaders sensed an opportunity to push for policy changes they had long advocated, while members of the Prime Minister's own party worried about the financial implications of any promises he might make. Emma looked up at Captain Mitchell, who gave her an encouraging nod. The guard captain was amazed by the child's composure and the profound impact her simple honesty was having on the entire Parliament. This was exactly what she had hoped might happen when she made the impossible decision to bring Emma into the chamber. "Emma," the Prime Minister said, turning back to her, "I want you to know that what you've done today is very important. You've helped all of us remember why we're here, to help people like your mother who need our support. But I need to be honest with you about something." The chamber held its collective breath, waiting to hear how the Prime Minister would handle this delicate moment. Television viewers across the country leaned forward, emotionally invested in the outcome of this unprecedented exchange. "The medicine your mother needs is very expensive," he continued carefully. "And there are many other people who also need help with different kinds of expensive treatments. As leaders, we have to find ways to help as many people as possible, with the money we have available." Emma's face fell slightly and she nodded with a maturity that seemed beyond her years. "I understand. Mummy explained that sometimes there isn't enough money to help everyone. But she also said that sometimes people can find ways to help if they really want to." Her simple words hit the Prime Minister like a revelation. Here was a child who understood scarcity and difficult choices better than many of his political colleagues, yet she still maintained hope that compassionate solutions could be found. She wasn't demanding miracles. She was simply asking the people in power to try harder to find ways to help. "You're absolutely right, Emma," he said, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "Sometimes we can find ways to help if we really want to. And I want you to know that I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure your mother gets the treatment she needs." A gasp rippled through the chamber. This was far beyond what anyone had expected. The Prime Minister had just made a personal commitment on live television to help this specific family. The political ramifications would be enormous, but looking at Emma's face lighting up with hope made every potential consequence seem worthwhile. "But more than that," he continued, addressing the full Parliament, "I believe we need to take a serious look at our healthcare policies and find better ways to help families like Emma's. No child should have to come to Parliament to beg for their parent's life." The chamber erupted in a mixture of applause, whispered arguments, and shocked exclamations. Some politicians jumped to their feet in support, while others frantically calculated the costs and political implications. But at the center of it all stood a small girl who had accomplished something that years of political debate had failed to achieve. She had reminded everyone present of their fundamental responsibility to care for the most vulnerable members of society. The chaos that erupted in the parliamentary chamber was unlike anything most members had ever witnessed. Some politicians applauded enthusiastically, moved by the Prime Minister's commitment to help Emma's family. Others sat in stunned silence, calculating the potential costs of such a precedent. A few opposition members jumped to their feet, demanding immediate details about how such promises would be funded and implemented. Through it all, Emma stood quietly beside Captain Mitchell, overwhelmed by the sudden attention but not quite understanding the magnitude of what she had just accomplished. The cameras that had been focused on the Prime Minister now zoomed in on her small figure, capturing her bewildered expression as flashbulbs popped throughout the chamber. Prime Minister Whitmore raised his hand for silence, and gradually the chamber settled down. "I know this is unprecedented," he said, his voice carrying a new authority born from moral conviction rather than political calculation. "But sometimes unprecedented situations require unprecedented responses." He turned to his chief advisor, who had made his way down from the gallery with a look of barely controlled panic. "I want you to contact the Ministry of Health immediately. Get me the details on Emma's mother's case, and I want options for immediate treatment authorization on my desk within the hour." The advisor leaned in close, whispering urgently about budget implications and policy precedents. The Prime Minister listened for a moment, then shook his head firmly. "Find a way," he said simply. "That's what we're paid to do. Find ways to help our citizens when they need us most." Captain Mitchell felt a mixture of relief and terror washing over her. Emma's brave appeal had clearly moved the Prime Minister, but she knew that her own career was far from secure. Breaking protocol on this scale, regardless of the outcome, would have serious consequences. However, watching Emma's hopeful face made her certain that she had made the right choice. Emma tugged gently on the Prime Minister's jacket sleeve. When he knelt down again, she whispered something that only he could hear. His expression softened even further, and he nodded solemnly, before standing up to address the chamber once more. "Emma has just reminded me of something very important," he announced. "She wants to make sure that other children whose parents are sick will also be able to get help. She's not just asking for herself. She's asking for everyone who faces similar situations." The profound selflessness of this request from a child who had just been promised help for her own desperate situation left many in the chamber visibly emotional. Here was an 8-year-old girl who, even in her moment of potential triumph, was thinking about others who might be suffering the same way she and her mother had suffered. Opposition leader Margaret Thompson stood up, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "Prime Minister, while we all admire this young lady's courage and your response to her plea, we need to discuss the practical implications of what you're proposing. How do we help Emma's family without creating unsustainable demands on our healthcare system?" It was a fair question and one that the Prime Minister had been grappling with even as he made his commitment. "You're absolutely right, Margaret," he replied. "This situation has highlighted a gap in our current system that we need to address systematically. not just emotionally. He paused, looking around the chamber at faces that reflected the full spectrum of political opinion. I propose that we establish an emergency review committee to examine cases like Emma's mother's. Situations where expensive treatments could save lives but fall outside our current funding parameters. We need to find sustainable ways to help families facing these impossible choices. The chamber buzzed with discussion as politicians began to engage seriously with the policy implications. What had started as an unprecedented breach of protocol was evolving into a substantive debate about healthcare policy and the role of government in protecting its most vulnerable citizens. Emma listened to the adult conversations swirling around her, understanding some words but missing many others. What she did understand was that the important people seemed to be taking her request seriously. Captain Mitchell kept a protective hand on her shoulder, still marveling at how this child's simple honesty had accomplished what years of political maneuvering had failed to achieve. "Emma," the Prime Minister said, kneeling down once more, "I need you to give me your mother's full name and the hospital where she's being treated. My helpers are going to contact her doctors today to start the process of getting her the medicine she needs." Emma's eyes filled with tears of relief and joy. "Her name is Sarah Jane Thompson and she goes to St. Mary's Hospital on Elm Street. Dr. Williams is her cancer doctor. Will you really be able to help her?" "I'm going to do everything in my power," he promised solemnly. "And Emma, I want you to know that what you did today took more courage than most adults ever show. You should be very proud of yourself." The little girl beamed, then suddenly looked worried. "Will Captain Mitchell get in trouble for helping me? She was very kind, and I don't want her to be punished for being nice." The Prime Minister looked up at Captain Mitchell, seeing in her face the same moral courage that had driven her to risk everything to give this child a voice. "Captain Mitchell showed excellent judgment today," he announced loudly enough for the entire chamber to hear. She recognized that sometimes our duty to protect and serve requires us to look beyond standard procedures. Her actions today reflect the highest values of public service. Relief flooded through Captain Mitchell as she realized that her career would not only survive this decision, but might actually be enhanced by it. More importantly, she had helped save a life and possibly changed healthcare policy for the better. As security personnel began to approach, clearly intending to escort Emma and Captain Mitchell from the chamber so that normal proceedings could resume, the Prime Minister held up his hand. "Before you go, Emma, is there anything else you want to tell us?" Emma thought for a moment, then spoke with the simple wisdom that only children possess. "Thank you for listening to me. My mummy always says that when people really listen to each other, they can solve almost any problem. I think she's right." With those words, she had summarized in one sentence what the entire political establishment had somehow forgotten: that genuine communication and compassion were the foundation of effective governance. As she and Captain Mitchell were gently escorted from the chamber, the debate that resumed behind them had a completely different tone from the sterile budget discussion that had preceded her arrival. 3 months later, the morning sun streamed through the windows of the small flower shop on Elm Street as Sarah Thompson arranged a beautiful bouquet of roses and lilies. Her hair had begun to grow back in soft brown curls, and though she was still thin from her treatments, there was color in her cheeks and strength in her movements that hadn't been there since before her husband's death. The experimental treatment had worked better than anyone had dared to hope. Within weeks of starting the medication, her cancer markers had begun to drop dramatically. The doctors were cautiously optimistic that she might achieve full remission, something that had seemed impossible just months earlier when Emma had made her desperate journey to Parliament House. "Mummy, look," Emma called out from behind the counter where she was doing her homework. She held up a newspaper with their photograph on the front page. The headline read, "The Thompson Healthcare Initiative passes Parliament. New program to help families facing medical crises." Sarah smiled as she read the article describing the new legislation that had emerged from Emma's brave intervention. The program would provide emergency funding for expensive treatments in cases where patients showed strong likelihood of recovery. It wasn't a perfect solution to all healthcare challenges, but it was a significant step toward ensuring that no family would face the impossible choice between financial ruin and losing a loved one. The bell above the shop door chimed as a familiar figure entered. Captain Mitchell, now promoted to Chief of Palace Security following widespread praise for her compassionate judgment, smiled warmly as she approached the counter. "How are my favorite ladies doing today?" she asked, accepting a hug from Emma, who had rushed over to greet her. "Mummy sold 12 bouquets already today," Emma announced proudly. "And she didn't get tired even once. Dr. Williams says her blood tests look really good." Captain Mitchell felt her heart swell with joy at seeing the dramatic transformation in both mother and daughter. Sarah looked like a completely different person from the desperate woman whose story Emma had shared in Parliament. The fear and exhaustion had been replaced by hope and renewed energy. "I have some news that might interest you both, Captain," Mitchell said, pulling out an official-looking envelope. "The Prime Minister has asked me to deliver this personally." Emma's eyes widened as she recognized the government seal on the envelope. Sarah opened it with trembling fingers and read aloud. "Mrs. Thompson, it would be our honor to invite you and Emma to attend the signing ceremony for the Thompson Healthcare Initiative next Friday. Your daughter's courage in speaking truth to power has inspired our entire nation and led to legislation that will help countless families facing similar challenges." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she continued reading. "The ceremony will include recognition of Captain Mitchell's exemplary service and judgment in facilitating Emma's historic appeal. We hope you will join us in celebrating not just this new program, but the reminder that the voices of ordinary citizens, even the smallest ones, have the power to create extraordinary change." Emma bounced excitedly. "Does this mean we get to see the important man again? Can I thank him for helping you get better?" "It means much more than that, sweetheart," Sarah said, kneeling down to Emma's level. "It means that what you did that day will help other children keep their mummies and daddies healthy. Dozens of families have already been approved for treatment through the new program." The impact of Emma's simple act of courage had rippled far beyond what anyone could have imagined. News outlets across the country had covered the story extensively, dubbing it the day Parliament remembered its heart. Social media campaigns had emerged using the hashtag #ListenLikeEmma, encouraging people to approach difficult conversations with the same honest directness that the 8-year-old had shown. Captain Mitchell had received hundreds of letters from citizens praising her decision to break protocol for a greater good. Several had come from parents whose own children had benefited from the new healthcare program, thanking her for having the courage to give Emma a voice when the system had failed them. "You know," Sarah said, watching Emma carefully arrange some daisies in a small vase, "sometimes I think about what might have happened if you hadn't been brave enough to go to that big building. If Captain Mitchell hadn't been kind enough to listen to you." Emma looked up thoughtfully. "But we'll never know, because sometimes good things happen when people decide to help each other, like you always taught me." The wisdom in those words struck both adults profoundly. This child had somehow understood, even in her darkest moment, that reaching out for help wasn't giving up. It was an act of faith in the goodness of others. Her willingness to be vulnerable had created space for others to show their compassion. The following weeks leading up to the ceremony, more details of the new program's success became public. 17 families had already received treatment approvals that would have been denied under the previous system. Children were able to stay with their parents instead of facing the trauma of losing them to treatable diseases. The program had been funded through a combination of budget reallocation and corporate partnerships, proving that creative solutions were possible when there was genuine will to help. Prime Minister Whitmore had privately admitted to his closest advisors that Emma's visit had been the most important moment of his political career. Not because it had gained him popularity, though polls showed overwhelming public support for his handling of the situation, but because it had reminded him why he had entered politics in the first place. He had started his career wanting to help people, but somewhere along the way the people had become statistics and the help had become policy abstractions. The flower shop had become something of a local landmark, with people stopping by not just to buy flowers but to meet the little girl who had changed healthcare policy, simply by telling the truth about her family's situation. Sarah had to gently establish boundaries to protect Emma's normal childhood, while still acknowledging the public interest in their story. I don't want Emma to feel like she has to be a spokesperson for anything, Sarah explained to Captain Mitchell during one of her regular visits. She did something brave because she loves her family, not because she wanted to be famous. I want her to just be a regular kid who happens to have done something extraordinary. Captain Mitchell understood completely. She had seen how media attention could distort people's lives, and she was protective of both Emma and Sarah. The Prime Minister has actually asked me to make sure you both have privacy protection if you want it, she said. He's very aware that Emma is still just a child who deserves a normal life. As the day of the ceremony approached, Emma grew more excited, but also more thoughtful. She had been invited to speak briefly at the event, and she was carefully considering what she wanted to say. Her teacher had offered to help her write a speech, but Emma preferred to speak from her heart, just as she had done in Parliament. "What are you thinking about, sweetheart?" Sarah asked one evening as they sat together after closing the shop. "I'm thinking about Daddy," Emma replied quietly. "I wish he could see that Mummy is getting better, and that something good came from all the sad things that happened to our family." Sarah pulled her daughter close, feeling the familiar ache of missing her husband mixed with gratitude for how much their lives had improved. "I think Daddy can see," she said softly, "and I think he's very proud of both of us for not giving up, even when things seemed impossible." The night before the ceremony, Emma laid out her best dress, a simple blue one that Sarah had bought for the occasion. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean and pretty, and Emma felt proud to wear it to such an important event. As she fell asleep, she dreamed about all the other children whose parents might get help because of the new program, and she felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that her scary day at the big building with all the flags had led to something wonderful. The morning of the ceremony dawned bright and clear. As they prepared to leave for Parliament House, Sarah looked at her daughter with immense pride. Emma had given her the gift of life by refusing to accept that nothing could be done. In return, Emma had learned that even when you're small, your voice can make a difference if you're brave enough to use it. Together, they had discovered that sometimes the most profound changes come not from grand gestures or political maneuvering, but from the simple act of one person caring enough about another to ask for help.